The annual St. Mary Mead Garden Society summer exhibition opened under a canopy of perfect June weather, with a kind of golden afternoon light that made even the most modest cottage garden appear touched by magic. The vicarage lawn stretched like green velvet between carefully tended flower borders, where prize dahlias nodded their heavy heads, and climbing roses cascaded over ancient stone walls in cascades of cream and crimson. Miss Jane Marple had positioned herself strategically beneath the spreading branches of an old apple tree, her knitting bag resting beside her folding chair and her keen eyes surveying the gentle chaos of village life with quiet satisfaction. She had attended this particular gathering for more years than she cared to count, and had learned that the most interesting observations often came not from the prize-winning blooms, but from watching the gardeners themselves navigate the delicate social terrain of rural competition. The centerpiece of this year's exhibition was undoubtedly the ornate Victorian birdbath that stood in the place of honor near the vicarage's French doors. Carved from pale limestone and adorned with intricate ivy patterns, it had been donated by Mrs. Helena Ashford, the village's newest resident, who had arrived from London 6 months prior with impeccable references and a mysteriously substantial income. The birdbath gleamed in the afternoon sun, its shallow basin filled with clear water that reflected the blue sky above like a mirror. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, resplendent in a floral dress that seemed designed to compete with her own prize-winning roses, held court near the tea table with her usual mixture of authority and barely concealed malice. Her sharp voice carried clearly across the lawn as she discussed, with evident disapproval, the declining standards of modern horticulture. "In my day," she declared to her captive audience, "we understood that proper gardening required patience and dedication, not simply throwing money at expensive ornaments." Her comment was clearly directed toward Mrs. Ashford, who stood some distance away examining her fingernails with studied concentration. Helena Ashford was an elegant woman in her early 40s, with prematurely silver hair worn in a sophisticated chignon that spoke of London salons rather than village life. She had entered several specimens in the competition, including a magnificent display of hybrid tea roses that had already attracted considerable attention from the judges. Colonel Weatherby, a military man whose retirement had done nothing to diminish his commanding presence, moved methodically through the displays with his clipboard, making careful notations in his precise handwriting. His weathered face remained impassive as he examined each entry, though Miss Marple noticed how his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when he paused before Mrs. Ashford's roses. The Colonel's own vegetable garden had won the prize for 3 consecutive years, and he clearly viewed any newcomer's success as a personal affront. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, had arrived fashionably late, his medical bag tucked under one arm and his tie slightly askew from his hurried journey from the surgery. He moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to being welcomed wherever he went, pausing to exchange pleasantries with the various exhibitors. Miss Marple observed with interest how his usually jovial manner seemed somewhat strained when he encountered Mrs. Ashford near the prize dahlia section. The afternoon proceeded with the gentle rhythm of rural tradition, punctuated by the distant sound of church bells and the occasional bark of a dog. Children darted between the displays like colorful butterflies, their laughter providing a cheerful counterpoint to the more serious business of horticultural judgment. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, bustled about with characteristic efficiency, ensuring that the tea urns remained properly filled and that the judging proceeded according to schedule. It was nearly 4 o'clock when young Timothy Fletcher, visiting from London for the summer holidays, came running across the lawn with his face flushed from excitement and something that looked distinctly like terror. He had been exploring the far reaches of the garden, where the formal displays gave way to wilder growth, and his breathless announcement brought the genteel proceedings to an abrupt halt. "There's something wrong by the birdbath," he gasped, pointing with a trembling finger toward the ornate stone structure. "Mrs. Ashford is there, but she won't answer when I speak to her." The crowd moved as one toward the bird bath, their earlier concerns about prize ribbons and judging protocols instantly forgotten. Dr. Haydock pushed through the gathering with professional authority, his medical training asserting itself as he knelt beside the crumpled figure lying in the shadow of the limestone basin. Helena Ashford lay motionless on the carefully manicured grass, her elegant dress stained with something dark that definitely was not garden soil. Her silver hair had come loose from its careful arrangement, and her usually composed features bore an expression of profound surprise. The bird bath above her seemed to loom with sudden menace, its carved ivy patterns casting intricate shadows across her still form. Dr. Haydock's examination was brief but thorough. When he looked up, his expression confirmed what the assembled villagers already suspected in their hearts. Mrs. Helena Ashford was dead, and the circumstances of her death suggested that the peaceful world of the St. Mary Mead Garden Society had been shattered as completely as fine china dropped on stone. Miss Marple remained quietly in her chair beneath the apple tree, her knitting forgotten in her lap as her sharp eyes took in every detail of the unfolding tragedy. She noted the way Colonel Weatherby's hands trembled as he removed his hat, how Mrs. Bantry's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied rouge, and how Dr. Haydock's usually steady voice carried an unfamiliar tremor as he quietly requested that someone telephone for the police. The gentle afternoon had been transformed into something altogether darker, and Miss Marple settled back to observe how her fellow villagers would respond to this most unwelcome disruption of their peaceful lives. The silence that settled over the vicarage garden following Dr. Haydock's grim pronouncement was peculiar in its completeness, as if the very air had thickened with shock. Even the sparrows seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, their usual chatter replaced by an expectant hush that made every small sound, the distant tick of the church clock, the rustle of leaves in the apple tree, the soft clink of abandoned teacups, seem unnaturally amplified. Miss Marple remained quietly in her chair beneath the spreading branches, her knitting forgotten in her lap as her sharp eyes took careful inventory of the scene before her. She observed how grief and shock manifested differently in each villager, like flowers responding to the same weather in their own particular ways. Mrs. Bantry had gone quite pale beneath her carefully applied rouge, yet her eyes darted about with unmistakable curiosity, already beginning to arrange the tragedy into a narrative that would suit her purposes. Colonel Weatherby stood rigidly at attention, his military bearing intact despite the obvious tremor in his hands as he repeatedly attempted to light his pipe. Dr. Haydock knelt beside the still form, his usual jovial manner replaced by professional gravity, though Miss Marple noticed how his gaze kept returning to the ornate bird bath that loomed above them like a silent witness. Young Timothy Fletcher sat frozen on the vicarage steps, his earlier excitement transformed into the wide-eyed stillness of a child who has glimpsed something far beyond his understanding. Within 20 minutes, the peaceful garden had been transformed into something resembling a stage set for tragedy. Inspector Slack arrived with characteristic efficiency, his perpetual expression of mild irritation seeming particularly pronounced as he surveyed the genteel scene of murder. His sergeant, a methodical young man named Lake, immediately began the process of establishing a perimeter and taking preliminary statements. "Nobody moves until we've had a proper look," Inspector Slack announced, his crisp voice cutting through the murmured conversations. "This is a crime scene now, not a garden party." He examined Mrs. Ashford's position with professional detachment, noting aloud to his sergeant that she lay with curious orderliness, as if she had simply decided to rest beside the limestone bird bath. Miss Marple found this observation particularly interesting. Indeed, Helena Ashford's position suggested none of the chaos typically associated with violent death. Her elegant dress remained properly arranged, her handbag lay undisturbed beside her with its contents intact, and even her shoes remained on her feet, though one had come slightly loose at the heel. Only her carefully arranged silver hair had come undone, spilling across the manicured grass like silk threads. The inspector's attention turned to the bird bath itself, and Miss Marple watched with quiet approval as he examined its limestone surface for signs of impact. The carved ivy patterns cast intricate shadows in the afternoon light, but revealed no obvious evidence of violence. What struck Miss Marple as particularly curious, however, was the condition of the water in the basin. It remained remarkably clear for late afternoon, when the village sparrows typically turned any standing water into a muddy soup within hours of its filling. As Inspector Slack continued his methodical examination, the assembled villagers began to arrange themselves into small groups, their initial shock giving way to the irresistible human urge to speculate and theorize. Mrs. Bantry had claimed a strategic position near the tea table, where she held court with several other ladies, her voice carrying clearly across the lawn. "Mark my words," she declared with characteristic authority, "this is clearly the work of some London criminal who followed that woman down here. She was far too secretive about her past, and now we see what comes of accepting strangers without proper references." Mrs. Price Ridley nodded sagely in agreement. "Indeed, Dolly. One hears whispers about women of means arriving out of nowhere, with no family mentioned and no clear source of income. It does make one wonder about her true circumstances." Colonel Weatherby, standing apart from the main group, offered his own perspective when questioned by the inspector. "Pleasant enough woman, I suppose," he said stiffly, though her horticultural methods were rather unorthodox for this parish. Her roses, while undeniably splendid, lacked the character that comes from proper English soil and patient cultivation. Dr. Haydock, having completed his preliminary examination, found himself surrounded by anxious villagers seeking reassurance. "Was it quick, Doctor? Did she suffer?" Mrs. Clement asked quietly, her hostess instincts struggling to maintain propriety even in the face of tragedy. "These matters are best left to the proper authorities," he replied diplomatically, though Miss Marple noticed how his eyes avoided direct contact with his questioners, and how his usually steady hands showed a slight tremor as he cleaned his spectacles. Young Timothy Fletcher, when gently questioned by Sergeant Lake, provided the most concrete information about the crucial moments before the discovery. "I was by the foxgloves, counting bees," he explained with the careful precision of a child trying to be helpful. "I heard a kind of splash, not a big one, like when you toss a pebble very gently into water. Then the thrush in the elm tree made a cross noise, the way they do when something disturbs them. That's when I saw her lying there." Miss Marple filed this detail away with particular interest. A splash suggested something had disturbed the birdbath's contents, yet the water remained unusually clear. She also noted that Timothy's account placed the disturbance before Mrs. Ashford was found, not after, which suggested the sequence of events might be more complex than initially apparent. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the police continued their methodical work, Miss Marple became increasingly aware of the subtle tensions rippling through the assembled villagers. Old friendships appeared strained under the weight of suspicion. Familiar conversations carried undercurrents of unease, and the easy camaraderie of the garden society had been replaced by something far more complex and potentially dangerous. Inspector Slack's systematic questioning revealed that Mrs. Ashford had been seen near the birdbath at approximately 3:30, apparently engaged in quiet conversation with someone whose identity remained frustratingly unclear. Several witnesses had noticed her there, but their attention had been focused on the ongoing judging process, leaving them unable to provide useful descriptions of her companion. The peaceful world of St. Mary Mead had been disrupted by more than simple murder, Miss Marple realized, as she watched the familiar faces around her transform under the pressure of suspicion and fear. The death of Helena Ashford had exposed the delicate network of relationships, rivalries, and secrets that lay beneath the surface of village life, like roots beneath carefully tended soil. As the formal investigation began in earnest, with statements to be taken and evidence to be gathered, Miss Marple settled back to observe how her fellow villagers would navigate this most unwelcome disruption to their ordered existence. The truth, she knew from long experience, would emerge not from official procedures alone, but from the careful observation of human nature under stress. The evening light cast long shadows across the vicarage lawn as Inspector Slack methodically arranged his witnesses for formal questioning. Miss Marple, having graciously accepted Mrs. Clement's offer of a chair on the terrace, positioned herself where she could observe both the proceedings and the subtle interplay of village relationships under stress. She had learned long ago that people revealed more about themselves when they believed they were being helpful rather than scrutinized. Mrs. Bantry approached the inspector's makeshift interview station with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being consulted on matters of local importance. Her statement was delivered with theatrical precision, complete with meaningful glances toward her fellow villagers and dramatic gestures toward the limestone birdbath. "I observed Mrs. Ashford throughout the afternoon," she declared, settling herself with evident satisfaction. "She seemed restless, Inspector, constantly moving about the displays rather than remaining in one place like a proper guest. At approximately 3:15, I noticed her examining the prize cards with unusual intensity, as if she were checking something specific rather than simply admiring the arrangements." Miss Marple noted with quiet interest that Mrs. Bantry's timeline placed Helena Ashford near the competition displays 15 minutes before young Timothy's account of the mysterious splash. The gap between these observations suggested a crucial period during which something significant had occurred, yet remained unaccounted for in the witness statements. Colonel Weatherby's testimony proved equally revealing, though perhaps not in ways he intended. When questioned about his movements during the relevant period, his military composure showed subtle signs of strain. "I stepped away from the main gathering to smoke my pipe near the old sundial," he explained stiffly. "Military habit, Inspector. One learns to seek solitude when contemplating important decisions. I was reviewing my assessment of this year's entries and considering whether certain irregularities warranted official comment." The inspector pressed him for details about these irregularities, and the colonel's discomfort became increasingly apparent. "If you must know, I had concerns about the authenticity of some of Mrs. Ashford's specimens. Her roses showed characteristics that suggested professional cultivation rather than amateur gardening. The pruning techniques, the soil amendments, even the variety selection indicated expertise far beyond what one would expect from a recent London transplant." Dr. Haydock's statement, when his turn came, revealed an unexpected dimension to the afternoon's events. "I arrived later than planned, due to an emergency call," he explained, his usual jovial manner subdued by the circumstances. "When I finally reached the exhibition, I sought out Mrs. Ashford specifically to apologize for my tardiness. We had arranged to discuss her garden's progress, you see. She had consulted me several weeks ago about certain botanical matters affecting her plantings." Miss Marple found this revelation particularly intriguing. A medical consultation about gardening matters seemed curious, especially given the doctor's well-known expertise in human rather than horticultural ailments. She observed how his hands showed a slight tremor when he spoke of the deceased and how his eyes avoided direct contact with his questioners. The most significant discovery came when Sergeant Lake presented Mrs. Ashford's handbag, which had been found lying beside her with curious orderliness. Among the usual feminine necessities was a small leather notebook filled with meticulous observations written in Helena's neat handwriting. Inspector Slack read several entries aloud, his voice carrying a note of puzzlement. She was certainly thorough in her observations. He commented, "Listen to this entry about Colonel Weatherby's vegetable garden. Exceptional yields despite poor drainage in southeast corner. Soil amendments suggest professional consultation or extensive prior experience. Query: military background includes agricultural training." The colonel's face flushed at this revelation, and he shifted uncomfortably. The woman was clearly conducting some sort of investigation into our gardening methods, he said defensively. Most irregular behavior for a newcomer to the parish. Dr. Haydock's expression grew increasingly thoughtful as the notebook's contents were revealed. When the inspector read an entry dated just 3 days prior, his reaction was particularly pronounced. Dr. H. consultation regarding unusual plant toxicity symptoms. Recommend further research into local species interactions. Important to verify safety protocols before next phase. What did she mean by next phase, Doctor? Inspector Slack inquired, his official tone carrying a subtle edge of suspicion. Dr. Haydock's reply came slowly, as if he were choosing his words with unusual care. I'm afraid I cannot say with certainty, Inspector. Our conversation was brief and focused primarily on general gardening safety. Mrs. Ashford was concerned about potential hazards to children and pets, a commendable attitude for any responsible gardener. Miss Marple found this explanation somewhat unsatisfactory, particularly given the specific reference to toxicity symptoms and safety protocols. She made a mental note to consider what other interpretations might fit the available evidence, while observing how the doctor's usual steady demeanor had been replaced by something approaching nervousness. As the formal questioning continued, the village's initial shock began to curdle into a potent brew of suspicion and gossip. Mrs. Price Ridley whispered urgently to her companions about Helena's secretive nature and her sudden withdrawal of a promised donation to the church roof fund just the previous week. The withdrawal, she suggested meaningfully, had occurred immediately after what she described as a heated discussion with someone whose identity she claimed not to know, though her meaningful glances toward Dr. Haydock suggested otherwise. Young Timothy Fletcher, when gently questioned again, provided one additional detail that had escaped his earlier account. After the splash, I heard footsteps on the gravel path, he said with careful precision. Quick steps, like someone was walking away very fast, but trying not to run. Miss Marple reflected on this new information as the afternoon investigation drew toward its close. The pattern of evidence suggested that Helena Ashford had been conducting her own investigation into village life, one that went far beyond casual social interest. Her detailed observations, her mysterious consultations with Dr. Haydock, and her apparent expertise in matters beyond amateur gardening indicated a purpose that none of her fellow villagers had fully understood. Most intriguingly, the physical evidence continued to present puzzles that the obvious explanations failed to address. The clear water in the bird bath, despite Timothy's account of a splash, remained an anomaly that nagged at Miss Marple's methodical mind. She had observed how Helena poured tea with her left hand earlier, yet her handbag had been found positioned at her right side with peculiar neatness. As arrangements were made for more formal proceedings the following day, Miss Marple settled back to consider how these various threads might weave together into a pattern that would reveal the truth behind Helena Ashford's untimely death. The peaceful world of St. Mary Mead had been disrupted by more than simple murder, and she sensed that the real investigation was only just beginning. The morning after Helena Ashford's death brought with it the peculiar atmosphere that settles over a village when tragedy has disrupted the natural order of things. A fine mist clung to the vicarage garden, softening the harsh reality of the previous day's events, though the limestone bird bath stood as an unmistakable reminder of what had transpired. Miss Marple arrived early for what she described to Mrs. Clement as a neighborly visit, though her sharp eyes were already cataloguing the subtle changes that shock and suspicion had wrought upon familiar faces. Inspector Slack had returned with renewed purpose, his systematic mind focused on building a case around the most obvious suspect. Colonel Weatherby's defensive behavior and the revealing entries in Helena's notebook had crystallized the inspector's thinking into a clear narrative of wounded pride escalating into violence. The military man's obvious discomfort when questioned about his gardening methods, combined with Helena's pointed observations about his professional consultation or extensive prior experience, painted a picture of someone with secrets worth protecting. The woman was clearly conducting some sort of investigation into our local practices. the colonel had declared stiffly during his second interview, his military bearing intact despite the obvious strain. Most irregular behavior for a newcomer to the parish, her questions went far beyond casual gardening interest. Miss Marple, observing from her strategic position near the morning tea service, noted how the colonel's indignation seemed genuine rather than calculated. His anger appeared to stem from wounded vanity rather than guilty conscience, though she kept this observation to herself as Inspector Slack methodically documented each defensive response as evidence of guilt. The discovery of additional physical evidence seemed to support the inspector's theory. A small card found in Helena's cottage bore the notation W330BB in her neat handwriting, clearly referencing an appointment with someone whose initial was W at the Birdbath. When confronted with this evidence, Colonel Weatherby's composure cracked slightly, though he maintained his innocence with military precision. However, it was Mrs. Bantry's sharp observation that provided the first significant puzzle piece. "Jane, you mentioned Helena's swallow brooch yesterday," she said quietly as they walked past the crime scene. "I distinctly admired it at 3:15, yet it wasn't on her when she was found. That sort of clasp doesn't simply fall off without being noticed." Miss Marple filed this detail away with particular interest. The missing brooch suggested either robbery or removal, yet Helena's handbag had remained untouched with its contents intact. The selective nature of what had been taken implied personal significance rather than monetary value. The mystery of the Birdbath's clear water was resolved when Mrs. Clement, wringing her hands with guilt, confessed to Miss Marple about her small deception. "I couldn't bear for the photographers to see it looking so untidy," she explained. "I asked Elsie to refill it with fresh water just before 3:30. She was so careful about it too, though she mentioned hearing a splash and quick footsteps just as she finished." This revelation transformed the timeline significantly. Young Timothy's account of hearing a splash now aligned perfectly with Elsie's water-changing activities, while the quick footsteps suggested someone departing the scene just as the fresh water was being added. The killer's timing had been either remarkably fortunate or carefully calculated. Dr. Haydick's involvement in the case deepened when he reluctantly revealed the true nature of his consultations with Helena. She believed someone was attempting to poison her. He confided to Miss Marple during a chance encounter near the village green. Her symptoms were consistent with gradual exposure to certain botanical toxins, specifically those found in common garden plants when improperly prepared. I advised her to document everything carefully. This medical revelation cast Helena's detailed observations in an entirely new light. Her notebook entries about village gardening practices suddenly appeared less like casual social investigation and more like the systematic documentation of someone who feared for her life. The irony that a woman who suspected poisoning had died beside a bird bath was not lost on Miss Marple. Further investigation into Helena's background revealed that she had not been entirely forthcoming about her reasons for settling in St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Emmett at the post office disclosed that Helena had been receiving regular correspondence marked personal and confidential, which she arranged to have delivered to her garden shed rather than the cottage. The secretive nature of these communications suggested purposes far beyond simple retirement to village life. She was asking very particular questions about people's backgrounds, Mrs. Finch, Helena's housekeeper, revealed when pressed. Not just gardening matters, but about their work histories, their family connections, even their financial circumstances. She kept careful records of everything in that notebook of hers. The discovery of pipe tobacco residue in Helena's cottage added another layer to the investigation. The scent clung to her blue cardigan, despite her well-known aversion to smoking. Colonel Weatherby's pipe-smoking habits made him an obvious suspect, though Miss Marple noted that several other villagers shared this particular vice. As the morning progressed, village opinion began to crystallize around the colonel as the most likely culprit. His pride, his competitive nature, and his obvious discomfort under questioning all contributed to a narrative that satisfied the community's need for explanation. Mrs. Bantry, ever the voice of local consensus, declared the matter practically settled, while Inspector Slack's confidence grew with each piece of circumstantial evidence. Miss Marple, however, remained quietly skeptical of the emerging consensus. Her long experience with human nature suggested that obvious suspects were often convenient distractions from more complex truths. The missing brooch, the timing of the water change, and the medical consultation about poisoning all pointed toward a more sophisticated crime than simple garden-variety murder, motivated by wounded pride. As the investigation continued to focus on Colonel Weatherby, Miss Marple settled back to observe how the various threads of evidence might weave together into a pattern that would reveal the true nature of Helena Ashford's death and the secrets that had made it necessary. The morning brought with it the peculiar atmosphere that settles over a village when tragedy has disrupted the natural order, though Miss Marple noted with quiet interest how quickly the residents of St. Mary Mead had begun to weave Helena Ashford's death into the familiar patterns of local gossip and speculation. She found herself particularly drawn to revisit the scene, ostensibly to offer comfort to Mrs. Clement, though her sharp eyes were cataloguing details that the official investigation might have overlooked. Young Timothy Fletcher approached her near the old oak tree with the careful precision that marked him as an unusually observant child. His revised account proved to be of considerable significance, creating a gap in the timeline that had previously seemed so straightforward. Upon reflection, he realized that the splash he had heard from the birdbath had occurred at least 10 minutes before he discovered Mrs. Ashford's body, during which time he had been thoroughly absorbed in counting bees among the foxgloves. "I called to her twice before I realized something was wrong," he confided with the earnest gravity of youth confronting mortality. She was lying so peacefully, almost as if she had chosen that particular spot for a rest. It wasn't until I came quite close that I noticed the dark stain on her dress. This revelation transformed Miss Marple's understanding of the sequence of events entirely. The gap between the mysterious splash and the discovery of the body suggested either that Helena had lain there unnoticed for several crucial minutes, or that her death had occurred through means more subtle than immediate violence. The implications were troubling, particularly when combined with Dr. Haydock's growing medical concerns about the case. The doctor's arrival seemed almost providential, though his usually jovial manner had been replaced by something approaching professional anxiety. His preliminary examination had revealed inconsistencies that contradicted the prevailing theory of death by blunt force trauma. The injury to her head was superficial, he explained carefully, glancing around to ensure their conversation remained private. Certainly painful, but not sufficient to cause death in a healthy woman of her age. Miss Marple absorbed this medical opinion with quiet satisfaction, as it confirmed her growing suspicion that Helena's death had been more carefully orchestrated than initially apparent. The arrangement of the body, the missing brooch, and now the revelation about the true cause of death all suggested a killer with both patience and considerable knowledge of human physiology. Her contemplation was interrupted by young Elsie, the vicarage maid, who approached with the eager conscience of someone carrying important information. From her pocket, she produced a tiny silver screw, no larger than a pinhead, with delicate threading that caught the morning light. "I found this under the hydrangea root this morning," she explained breathlessly. "It made a little clink when I heard those quick footsteps yesterday, like metal on stone." Miss Marple examined the screw with considerable interest, noting its precise craftsmanship and unusual size. When she presented it to Sergeant Lake, his response proved illuminating. "That's not from a brooch, ma'am," he said with professional certainty. "Looks more like the screw from a miniature atomizer or one of those little scent vials. They have threads exactly like this." The connection to Helena's missing swallow brooch suddenly became clearer, though in ways that complicated rather than simplified the investigation. Mrs. Finch, when gently questioned, revealed that Helena had indeed carried a small atomizer for her delicate constitution, particularly during church services, where the incense proved troublesome. The discovery of an empty velvet case in Helena's bedroom, with no corresponding bottle, suggested that whatever the atomizer had contained might be crucial to understanding her death. Meanwhile, village opinion continued to crystallize around Colonel Weatherby as the obvious culprit. Inspector Slack's confidence grew with each piece of circumstantial evidence, while Mrs. Bantry declared the matter practically settled. The Colonel's defensive behavior, his competitive nature, and the damning notation in Helena's appointment book all contributed to a narrative that satisfied the community's need for explanation. Miss Marple, however, found herself increasingly skeptical of this convenient conclusion. Her long experience with human nature suggested that obvious suspects were often elaborate distractions from more complex truths. The tobacco residue on Helena's cardigan, while matching the Colonel's preferred brand, struck her as oddly convenient. She recalled observing several pipe smokers at the garden party, and the residue itself was not overwhelmingly abundant, suggesting perhaps a deliberate rather than accidental transfer. More intriguingly, she had noticed Helena's left-handed tea service the previous afternoon, yet her handbag had been found positioned at her right side with peculiar neatness. Such details might seem insignificant to others, but Miss Marple had learned that human behavior under stress rarely maintained such careful attention to propriety. The arrangement suggested either unusual presence of mind in a dying woman or deliberate staging by someone with intimate knowledge of social conventions. Dr. Haydock's earlier revelation about Helena's fears of gradual poisoning added another layer of complexity to the case. A woman who suspected systematic attempts on her life through botanical toxins seemed unlikely to succumb to sudden violence during a garden party confrontation. The timing felt almost too convenient, diverting attention from the more subtle, ongoing threat that Helena had been documenting so carefully. As the morning progressed and official certainty about the Colonel's guilt solidified, Miss Marple settled back to consider how these various threads might weave together into a pattern that would reveal the true nature of Helena Ashford's death. The missing atomizer, the revised timeline, the superficial head wound, and the careful arrangement of evidence all suggested a crime far more sophisticated than village gossip was prepared to acknowledge. The question now was whether the killer had acted from personal desperation or professional necessity, and whether the truth would emerge before an innocent man paid the price for someone else's carefully calculated crime. The afternoon brought Miss Marple to Helena Ashford's cottage, where she had arranged what she described to Mrs. Finch as a neighborly visit to offer comfort during these difficult times. The housekeeper, red-eyed but determined to be useful, admitted her with visible relief, as if the presence of someone genuinely interested in understanding rather than simply gossiping provided a welcome respite from the morning's official questioning. The cottage's sitting room maintained the melancholy neatness of a space arranged by someone who would not return to disturb its careful order. Miss Marple's experienced eye catalogued the details that spoke of Helena's methodical nature, particularly the dressing table where brushes and jars stood in precise arrangement. What caught her attention immediately was the empty space among the toiletries, marked by two faint rings on the polished wood surface, one slightly smaller than the other, suggesting a matched set that had once stood companionably side by side. The police noted the missing items, Mrs. Finch explained, following Miss Marple's gaze. A little velvet case that held her atomizer and another small bottle she kept beside it. Always together they were, like a proper pair. She was particular about having her remedies close at hand, especially during the warmer weather when the church incense troubled her breathing. Miss Marple absorbed this information while noting the faint, sweet fragrance that lingered in the air, something delicate and green, like lily of the valley, or perhaps sweet woodruff. It was an innocent scent, yet she recalled Dr. Haydock's casual mention in another case that the most dangerous botanical compounds often bore the prettiest names and most appealing fragrances. Her gentle inquiries led her next to Mr. Petherick's chemist shop, where the proprietor's methodical nature proved invaluable. When approached with the sort of casual questions that elderly ladies might ask about remedies and atomizers, he consulted his ledger with religious precision. "Replacement screws for the smaller atomizers?" he repeated thoughtfully. "Indeed, we had an inquiry just last week. A gentleman with very precise hands, medical sort, I thought, asked about repair kits for the delicate mechanisms. We don't stock such specialized items, but I directed him to Much Benham, where they carry a more complete selection. He purchased spirits of lavender and asked several technical questions about concentrations and applications." Miss Marple found this information particularly intriguing when combined with young Elsie's discovery of the tiny silver screw beneath the hydrangea roots. The precision of the threading and the delicate craftsmanship suggested exactly the sort of mechanism Mr. Petherick had described, while the medical hands detail added another layer to her growing understanding of the case. Her encounter with Inspector Slack near the village green revealed the significant development that would reshape the entire investigation. Dr. Haydock's preliminary examination had confirmed that Helena's head injury, while painful, had not been sufficient to cause death in a healthy woman of her age. The true cause had been heart failure brought on by exposure to a potent plant-derived toxin, administered with a sophistication that suggested considerable botanical and medical knowledge. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing, the inspector admitted grudgingly, his earlier confidence in a simple solution clearly shaken. The question now is how the substance was administered at a public gathering without anyone noticing, and where the delivery mechanism has disappeared to. Miss Marple's subsequent conversation with Dr. Haydock provided crucial insights into Helena's state of mind during her final weeks. The doctor, his usual jovial manner, replaced by professional concern, revealed that Helena had consulted him about symptoms consistent with gradual poisoning, nausea, dizziness, and occasional tremors that suggested systematic exposure to botanical toxins. She was convinced someone was attempting to undermine her health, he explained quietly, his hands showing a slight tremor as he cleaned his spectacles. I advised her to document everything carefully, though I had hoped her fears were simply the result of adjustment anxiety from her move to village life. She spoke of conducting what she called a testing phase that would conclude around the time of the garden party, after which she intended to confront whoever was responsible. This revelation cast Helena's meticulous notebook entries in an entirely new light. Her detailed observations of village gardening practices, her questions about botanical safety, and her systematic documentation suddenly appeared less like casual social investigation, and more like the careful work of someone who feared for her life and was determined to identify her tormentor. The afternoon's most significant development came when Colonel Weatherby, under increasing pressure from Inspector Slack's questioning, finally revealed the true nature of his appointment with Helena. His military composure cracked as he admitted to what he described as a matter of considerable financial delicacy. Mrs. Ashford had discovered certain irregularities in my pension arrangements, he confessed with obvious humiliation. Nothing criminal, you understand, but oversights made during my hurried retirement that could have proved embarrassing if brought to official attention. She offered to help rectify the situation for a substantial consultancy fee. Our appointment was to finalize the arrangements and exchange the necessary documentation. Miss Marple noted the genuine embarrassment in the colonel's voice, recognizing the particular shame that a proud military man would feel at having his financial affairs scrutinized by a newcomer to the village. While this revelation provided a clear motive for silence, it didn't align with the sophisticated nature of the crime or the careful planning that the physical evidence suggested. The discovery of Helena's broken brooch clasp near the hydrangea roots added another piece to the puzzle. Sergeant Lake's examination revealed not only the violence with which it had been removed, but also traces of what appeared to be old adhesive on the metal surface. The combination of the broken hinge and the adhesive residue suggested that the brooch had been recently repaired, possibly modified to serve a purpose beyond simple ornamentation. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the village settled into the uneasy rhythm that follows violent disruption, Miss Marple found herself considering how these various elements might fit together. Helena's systematic approach to documenting her suspected poisoning, the missing atomizer with its precise mechanism, the gentleman with medical hands seeking repair parts, and the broken brooch with its hidden modifications all pointed toward a crime far more sophisticated than village gossip was prepared to acknowledge. The revelation that Helena had been conducting her own investigation into attempts on her life transformed her from simple victim to active participant in the deadly game that had culminated beside the limestone birdbath. Her death represented not just the end of her life, but the abrupt interruption of a carefully constructed investigation that had been building toward its own dramatic conclusion. Miss Marple settled back to observe how the various suspects would respond to these new revelations, while keeping careful watch for the subtle signs that would reveal which of her fellow villagers possessed both the knowledge and the desperation necessary to orchestrate such an elaborate crime. The truth, she knew, lay not in the obvious connections that satisfied official investigation, but in the delicate details that everyone else seemed determined to overlook. The evening brought with it a development that would transform Miss Marple's understanding of the entire case, though it arrived through the trembling voice of Mrs. Finch at the vicarage door. The housekeeper's usual composure had given way to genuine fear as she reported that someone had broken into Helena Ashford's garden shed during the night, targeting not the valuable gardening tools or equipment, but a specific locked wooden box where Helena had kept what she described as her private correspondence. Inspector Slack's initial dismissiveness evaporated when he examined the scene. The padlock had been cut with professional precision, and the intruder had shown remarkable selectivity in their search. Only one item appeared to be missing from the scattered contents, a bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon, the very correspondence that Helena had insisted on collecting personally from the post office and reading in complete privacy. Miss Marple found this development particularly illuminating when considered alongside Helena's systematic approach to documenting village life. If these letters contained evidence of the investigation Helena had been conducting into her suspected poisoning, then their theft represented not merely the covering of tracks, but the active destruction of accumulated proof. The killer had not simply silenced Helena, but was now methodically erasing all traces of her detective work. Dr. Haydock's reaction to news of the break-in proved equally revealing. When approached by Inspector Slack for his medical opinion on the implications, his usual jovial manner showed distinct signs of strain. His hands trembled slightly as he cleaned his spectacles, and Miss Marple noted how his eyes avoided direct contact when discussing Helena's fears about systematic poisoning attempts. If Mrs. Ashford had been documenting evidence of ongoing threats to her health, he said carefully, then the theft of her private papers suggests someone with considerable desperation to prevent that evidence from reaching official attention. The medical knowledge required for the type of poisoning we've identified would be quite specialized. The evening's second significant discovery came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Clement, still wrestling with guilt over her decision to refill the birdbath, approached Miss Marple with a small velvet case she had found among the church donation items. The case, designed to hold a brooch, was empty save for a faint circular stain on the silk lining, and its clasp showed signs of recent damage. "I found it mixed in with the jumble donations," Mrs. Clement explained quietly. "Someone must have included it without thinking, though it seems too good for the charity bin. The lining has an odd smell, rather medicinal, like spirits of lavender mixed with something else." Miss Marple examined the case with considerable interest, noting how the circular stain aligned perfectly with the size of Helena's missing swallow brooch. The medicinal odor suggested that the brooch had been modified to serve a purpose beyond simple ornamentation, possibly as a delivery mechanism for the botanical toxin that had caused Helena's death. Young Timothy Fletcher's evening contribution proved equally valuable. His sharp eyes had spotted the mysterious gentleman with medical hands returning to examine the prize roses near where Helena had fallen, though not with the casual interest of a garden enthusiast. He was looking for something specific, Timothy reported with characteristic precision. When he noticed me watching, he moved away quickly and pretended to examine the vegetables instead. His fingernails were very clean, not like someone who actually works in gardens. The combination of these discoveries painted a picture of sophisticated premeditation that went far beyond the simple confrontation that village gossip had imagined. Someone with medical knowledge had modified Helena's brooch to serve as a delivery system for botanical poison, administered it during the garden party when she bent to admire her reflection in the birdbath's clear water, then carefully disposed of the evidence among church donations while stealing the letters that documented Helena's investigation. Miss Marple's gentle questioning of Mrs. Finch revealed additional details about Helena's final weeks that supported this theory. She had been asking very particular questions about everyone's health and gardening practices, the housekeeper confided. Not just casual inquiries, but specific questions about who grew their own herbs and who purchased remedies from Mr. Petherick's shop. She seemed especially interested in anyone with medical training or botanical expertise. The stolen letters, Mrs. Finch confirmed, had arrived regularly over the past several months, always marked personal and confidential, and always read in complete privacy. Helena's careful notes in her leather notebook often followed the arrival of these letters, suggesting they contained information crucial to her investigation into the systematic attempts on her life. As the evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple found herself considering how these various elements fit together into a pattern that revealed the true sophistication of the crime. Helena's death had not been the result of wounded pride or garden party rivalry, but rather the culmination of a carefully orchestrated plan to silence someone who had discovered a dangerous secret about village life. The question now was whether Helena's testing phase had been designed to force her tormentor into revealing themselves, and whether her death represented the successful completion of that plan or its tragic interruption. The theft of the letters suggested that the killer was still actively covering their tracks, which meant the danger to anyone who might uncover the truth remained very real indeed. Miss Marple settled back to observe how her fellow villagers would respond to these new revelations, while keeping careful watch for the subtle signs that would reveal which of them possessed both the medical knowledge and the desperate motivation necessary to orchestrate such an elaborate and ongoing deception. The peaceful world of St. Mary Mead had been disrupted by something far more complex than simple murder, and she sensed that the most dangerous moments of the investigation still lay ahead. The morning brought Miss Marple an unexpected visitor in the form of Mrs. Price Ridley, whose usual composure had been replaced by something approaching genuine distress. She arrived at the cottage garden gate with the particular urgency that marked someone carrying information too dangerous to ignore, yet too delicate to share with official authorities without careful consideration. "Jane, I must speak with you about something that has been troubling me terribly," she began, her voice carrying an uncharacteristic tremor. "Yesterday evening, while arranging flowers for the church, I overheard Dr. Haydock speaking with someone in the vestry. Their discussion was most peculiar, focusing on botanical preparations and their effects on the human system. What troubled me most was how intimately familiar he seemed with the specific methods used in poor Mrs. Ashford's death." Miss Marple settled her visitor with tea and gentle encouragement, recognizing the signs of someone wrestling with conflicting loyalties between discretion and duty. The implications of Mrs. Price Ridley's observation aligned disturbingly well with her own growing suspicions about the village doctor's involvement in the increasingly complex case. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Emmett from the post office, breathless with the importance of her discovery. The postmistress had recalled crucial details about Helena's mysterious correspondence that transformed the entire investigation. The blue-ribboned letters had come with clockwork regularity from Wycherley Analytical Laboratory in London, a private firm specializing in toxicological analysis rather than casual gardening advice. The most extraordinary thing happened this morning, Mrs. Emmett continued with professional indignation. Sergeant Lake requested duplicate reports from the laboratory, but within an hour, someone telephoned pretending to be him and cancelled the order. Not the sergeant's voice at all, mind you. Too careful, too precise, and he kept pausing as if reading from notes. Miss Marple found this development particularly illuminating. Someone was actively interfering with the official investigation, demonstrating both intimate knowledge of police procedures and desperate urgency to prevent Helena's scientific documentation from reaching official attention. The killer was not merely covering tracks, but actively sabotaging the investigation from within the village itself. Inspector Slack's subsequent telephone call to the laboratory confirmed their worst fears. Helena had been systematically documenting symptoms of gradual poisoning over several months, sending plant samples and detailed observations for professional analysis. The stolen letters had contained scientific confirmation of lily-of-the-valley toxin in concentrations that suggested deliberate, ongoing administration by someone with considerable botanical and medical expertise. Dr. Haydock's reaction to news of the laboratory correspondence proved particularly revealing. When approached by Inspector Slack for his medical opinion on the implications, his usual jovial manner showed distinct signs of strain. His hands trembled as he cleaned his spectacles, and Miss Marple noted how his eyes avoided direct contact when discussing Helena's systematic approach to documenting her suspected poisoning. The afternoon brought additional evidence that painted an increasingly clear picture of sophisticated premeditation. Mr. Petherick's recollection of a gentleman with medical hands, purchasing atomizer repair components and inquiring about plant-based toxin preparations, aligned perfectly with the modified brooch mechanism that had delivered Helena's fatal dose. The precision required for such modification indicated not only botanical knowledge, but considerable skill with delicate mechanical components. Young Timothy Fletcher's contribution proved equally significant when he finally shared his complete observation of the crucial moments following Helena's collapse. I saw someone examining the birdbath rim very carefully, as if looking for something specific, he confided with characteristic precision. When they noticed me watching, they moved away quickly and joined the crowd. Their hands were very steady, not shaking like everyone else's were. Miss Marple found herself drawn to seek out Dr. Haydock for what she described as a neighborly conversation about the village's response to recent tragic events. She encountered him near his surgery, supervising the delivery of medical supplies with uncharacteristic nervousness. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of strain, and his movements lacked their customary confidence. "Such a trying time for everyone," she began conversationally, "especially for those burdened with caring for our physical and emotional well-being. Poor Mrs. Ashford, with her delicate constitution and those peculiar symptoms she mentioned just before the exhibition. She spoke of conducting a testing phase to identify the source of her distress. Such a scientific approach for someone without formal medical training." Dr. Haydock's reaction was immediate and telling. His face grew pale, and a muscle twitched in his jaw as he shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Ashford was prone to anxieties," he replied, his voice carefully controlled. "Many newcomers find village life challenging. I encouraged documentation as general practice, but certainly didn't endorse self-experimentation." Miss Marple continued with gentle persistence, mentioning the stolen letters, the modified brooch mechanism, and young Timothy's observation of someone with remarkably clean hands examining the crime scene. With each detail, Dr. Haydock's composure cracked further, his professional mask slipping to reveal something approaching panic. "The hand that tends the garden," Miss Marple observed quietly, "often reveals more about its owner than intended, particularly when that hand possesses the knowledge to transform innocent flowers into instruments of death and the skill to create delivery mechanisms of remarkable sophistication." Dr. Haydock's eyes met hers for a fleeting moment, wide and suddenly devoid of their usual warmth. In that instant, Miss Marple saw not the jovial village doctor, but a man trapped by the gentle yet relentless probing of someone who had seen through his carefully constructed deception. His gaze fell to his own immaculately clean hands before he retreated hastily into his surgery, leaving Miss Marple alone with the satisfaction of having observed the critical reaction that confirmed her growing certainty about Helena Ashford's killer. The pieces of the puzzle were finally aligning into their inevitable pattern, and Miss Marple settled back to consider how best to ensure that justice would be served without allowing a desperate man to claim additional victims in his efforts to escape the consequences of his carefully calculated crime. The following evening brought Miss Marple to what she privately recognized as the crucial moment of her investigation. She had arranged what appeared to be a simple gathering at her cottage to discuss memorial arrangements for Helena Ashford, though her true purpose was far more deliberate. The participants included Inspector Slack, Colonel Weatherby, Mrs. Bantry, and Dr. Haydock himself, each invited for reasons that would become apparent as the evening progressed. Miss Marple had positioned a small arrangement of lily-of-the-valley near the window, their delicate white bells catching the lamplight with deceptive innocence. She observed with quiet satisfaction how each guest reacted upon entering. Mrs. Bantry exclaimed over their beauty. Colonel Weatherby gave them a perfunctory military acknowledgment, while Dr. Haydock's eyes lingered on them for just a fraction too long before he deliberately moved to seat himself with his back to the flowers. "I've been reflecting on poor Mrs. Ashford's methodical nature," Miss Marple began conversationally, her knitting needles maintaining their gentle rhythm. Such careful documentation of her health concerns, her systematic approach to gathering evidence. Her notebook revealed someone who understood the importance of scientific investigation, particularly regarding botanical toxins and their effects on human physiology. Dr. Haydock shifted slightly in his chair, his usually steady hands showing the first subtle signs of tension as he reached for his teacup. Miss Marple noted how he avoided adding sugar, despite his usual preference for it, as if his concentration was entirely focused elsewhere. "What strikes me as particularly significant," she continued with apparent casualness, "is how Helena's investigation was approaching its conclusion just as the garden party provided such a convenient opportunity. The timing suggests careful observation of her methods by someone who understood both her schedule and her scientific approach." From her work basket, Miss Marple produced the small velvet case that Mrs. Clement had found among the church donations, handling it with the delicate care one might show a butterfly's wing. "This little case has such an interesting medicinal fragrance," she observed, passing it gently around the group. "Spirits of lavender mixed with something rather more complex. Mr. Petherick mentioned that someone with remarkably clean hands had inquired about atomizer mechanisms and botanical preparations." When the case reached Dr. Haydock, Miss Marple watched with particular attention as he examined it. His fingers, those immaculately maintained medical hands, traced the circular stain on the silk lining with unconscious familiarity before he caught himself and set it aside with studied indifference. "The modification of Helena's brooch to serve as a delivery mechanism," Miss Marple continued thoughtfully, "required considerable skill with delicate mechanisms. The precision of the threading, the careful calibration of dosage, the knowledge of how botanical compounds might be concentrated and administered through such subtle means." She produced the borrowed swallow brooch from her work basket, its clasp deliberately loosened by her earlier preparations. "I wonder if someone might demonstrate how such mechanisms function. The clasp seems rather stubborn, and my fingers are not as nimble as they once were." Mrs. Bantry attempted first, fumbling with the delicate mechanism, followed by Colonel Weatherby, who excused himself with gruff humor about never managing his late wife's jewelry. When the brooch reached Dr. Haydock, Miss Marple observed with quiet triumph as his professional instincts overcame his caution. His fingers found the precise angle, the corrective twist, the minute adjustment that secured the clasp with practiced efficiency. "How remarkably skillful," Miss Marple murmured with gentle appreciation. "One can see the benefit of medical training in such delicate work, though I notice you've positioned it as a right-handed person would wear it. Helena, being left-handed, always wore her brooch oriented quite differently." The observation hung in the air like morning mist, seemingly innocent yet carrying implications that Dr. Haydock could not ignore. His face had grown pale, and Miss Marple noted how his eyes avoided direct contact with anyone in the room. "The stolen letters from Wycherley Analytical Laboratory," she continued with relentless gentleness, "contained scientific confirmation of lily-of-the-valley toxin in concentrations that indicated deliberate, systematic administration over several months. Someone had been conducting what might almost be called a medical experiment, documenting the gradual effects with professional detachment." Inspector Slack leaned forward with growing understanding, recognizing the careful web of evidence that Miss Marple was weaving around the increasingly uncomfortable doctor. The room had grown quiet, except for the gentle tick of the mantelpiece clock and the soft clicking of knitting needles. "What troubles me most," Miss Marple said quietly, "is the telephone call that cancelled the laboratory reports. Mrs. Emmett described the caller's voice as too careful, too precise, with the sort of measured diction one might expect from someone accustomed to giving medical instructions over the telephone." Dr. Haydock's composure finally began to crack visibly. His hands, those steady professional hands that had administered death with scientific precision, showed a distinct tremor as he reached for his handkerchief. The gesture was small, but Miss Marple had been watching for exactly such unconscious betrayals. "Helena's investigation threatened to expose more than simple poisoning," she continued with gentle persistence. "Her inquiries into botanical toxicity and local species interactions suggested she had uncovered a pattern of systematic experimentation. Someone who viewed patients not as people to be healed, but as subjects to be studied, documented, perhaps even eliminated when they became inconvenient." The accusation, delivered with Miss Marple's characteristic mildness, struck Dr. Haydock with the force of a physical blow. His professional mask slipped entirely, revealing something approaching panic as he realized the careful web of deception he had constructed was unraveling beyond repair. "She was going to destroy everything," he said suddenly, his voice carrying the desperate edge of a cornered man. Helena had documented not just her own case, but patterns in other deaths, other patients whose symptoms had been attributed to natural causes. Her scientific approach threatened to expose years of careful research, of advancing medical knowledge through methods that conventional ethics would never permit. The confession spilled out with the relief of a man who had finally been cornered by someone who understood the full scope of his crimes. Inspector Slack moved with professional efficiency to place Dr. Haydock under arrest, while Miss Marple continued her knitting with quiet satisfaction, taking no pleasure in the destruction of a man who had perverted his healing knowledge for such twisted purposes. The peaceful world of St. Mary Mead had been disrupted by something far more sinister than simple murder, and Miss Marple reflected on how easily evil could disguise itself behind the familiar mask of professional respectability and community service. The gentle doctor who had tended their ailments with apparent dedication had been conducting experiments in death with the detached curiosity of a scientist studying laboratory specimens, turning the sacred trust of medicine into an instrument of calculated destruction. The weight of Dr. Haydock's confession settled over Miss Marple's sitting room like a shroud, though she continued her knitting with characteristic composure, while Inspector Slack moved with professional efficiency to complete the arrest. The village doctor sat slumped in defeat, his carefully maintained facade finally crumbling under the gentle but relentless pressure of Miss Marple's methodical investigation. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said quietly, her needles clicking in their familiar rhythm, "I should explain how the various pieces of this puzzle fit together, for the benefit of those who have been so patient with an old woman's observations." She set down her knitting and regarded the assembled group with a gentle authority that came from decades of understanding human nature in all its complexity. Helena Ashford came to St. Mary Mead not for peaceful retirement, but as a forensic chemist investigating a very personal threat. The letters from Wycherley Analytical Laboratory confirmed what her scientific training had already suggested. She was being systematically poisoned with lily-of-the-valley toxin, administered with a precision that required both botanical knowledge and medical expertise. Dr. Haydock's hands trembled as she continued, his professional mask finally abandoned. Her notebook entries about gardening practices were actually careful documentation of symptoms, timing, and potential sources of the toxin within our village. When she consulted you about botanical safety, Doctor, she was testing your knowledge while gathering evidence of your involvement. Miss Marple picked up the small velvet case, handling it with delicate care. The modification of Helena's swallow brooch required considerable skill with precision instruments. The tiny screw that young Elsie found beneath the hydrangea roots came from the atomizer mechanism you had installed within the brooch itself. Mr. Petherick's recollection of a gentleman with medical hands purchasing repair components confirmed the professional nature of this modification. Inspector Slack leaned forward with growing understanding. But how was the poison actually administered during the garden party? The birdbath provided the perfect opportunity, Miss Marple explained. Helena was left-handed, yet her handbag was found positioned to her right side, and her brooch had been arranged as a right-handed person would wear it. Dr. Haydock knew her vanity about her appearance and her habit of checking her reflection in still water. When she bent to admire herself in the freshly filled bird bath, he activated the concealed mechanism in her brooch, releasing a concentrated dose of lily-of-the-valley extract directly onto her skin and clothing. She paused, allowing the implications to settle. The splash young Timothy heard was not Helena falling, but the poison being released. The quick footsteps he observed were Dr. Haydock's retreat from the scene. He then returned, feigning concern, to examine the area and ensure no evidence remained, which Timothy noted as unusually steady behavior among all the shocked villagers. Colonel Weatherby, his military bearing intact despite the revelations, asked quietly, "The pipe tobacco residue on her cardigan." "A deliberate misdirection," Miss Marple replied. "Dr. Haydock knew of your appointment with Helena and your smoking habits, Colonel. A small amount of tobacco residue, carefully transferred to her clothing, would implicate you while diverting suspicion from himself. The timing was calculated to coincide with your meeting, creating an obvious suspect with apparent motive." Dr. Haydock's voice, when he finally spoke, carried the hollow tone of complete defeat. Helena's investigation threatened to expose years of careful research. She had documented not just her own case, but patterns in other deaths throughout the village. 7 patients over 3 years, each contributing valuable data about botanical toxicology and its effects on different physiological conditions. The room fell silent as the full scope of his crimes became clear. Mrs. Bantry, for once speechless, stared at the man who had tended their ailments while conducting deadly experiments on their neighbors. The sacred trust between doctor and patient had been perverted into something monstrous, turning instruments of healing into weapons of calculated murder. The stolen letters contained scientific proof of your systematic poisoning, Miss Marple continued. When you realized Helena's testing phase was approaching its conclusion and she intended to confront you publicly, you acted with desperate efficiency. The break-in at her garden shed, the cancelled laboratory reports, the careful staging of her death, all designed to eliminate both Helena and the evidence she had accumulated. As Inspector Slack completed the formal arrest procedures and Dr. Haydock was led away, the remaining villagers sat in stunned contemplation of how thoroughly they had been deceived. The gentle physician who had brought comfort in their times of need had viewed them not as people deserving care, but as subjects suitable for experimentation. In the days that followed, St. Mary Mead struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the betrayal. The Garden Society postponed future exhibitions, unable to face the scene where their trust had been so violently shattered. Mrs. Clement organized a modest memorial planting beside the birdbath, choosing roses of honest scent and gentle habit, while Colonel Weatherby contributed a simple oak bench inscribed with Helena's name. Miss Marple walked through the village in the evenings, observing how her neighbors gradually rebuilt the bonds of community that Dr. Haydock's crimes had damaged. Mrs. Bantry's pronouncements carried new thoughtfulness, while young Timothy's questions about trust and safety received careful, honest answers from the adults around him. The limestone birdbath remained in the vicarage garden, its clear water reflecting the sky with innocent beauty, though visitors now spoke more quietly of gardens and their curious resemblance to the people who tend them. The peaceful facade of rural life had been permanently altered by the knowledge that evil could flourish behind the most trusted faces. As Miss Marple settled into her evening routine, her knitting needles clicking in their familiar rhythm, she reflected on the eternal vigilance required to protect the vulnerable from those who would exploit their trust. Human nature, she knew, contained both the capacity for great kindness and terrible cruelty, often hidden beneath the most respectable surfaces. The price of safety lay not in naive trust, but in the careful observation of character revealed through small, habitual actions. The way a man reached for a delicate clasp, the precision of his voice on the telephone, the steadiness of his hands in moments when others trembled with shock. The gentle world of St. Mary Mead would heal, as communities always do, but it would remember the lesson that Helena Ashford's courage had taught them, that the most dangerous predators often wear the masks of those we trust most completely.